This is that SVT after an awful lot of work was done. Let me show you some of the stuff I did and the whys, and then we'll talk about what we need to do next. All right, here in the preamp stuff that was all messed up before with that terminal strip that was held in place by silicone. It was originally a terminal strip that was attached here and extended this way and this way. This side broke, and rather than replace it, which is fairly easy to do, the previous tech siliconed it in place. Anyway, I put in 2 new terminal strips, and each one is mounted with 2 connections. They're not, there's no ground made there. That's just chassis connections. So, oops. So I've got the polarity switch disconnected from anything. It's just there to be cosmetics, no need for polarity. I've got a new lamp holder, which is red, and it's visible, and it works. This was tricky. The original power switch was long gone, and there is no really good replacement. This amp takes a 10 amp fuse, so it needed at least 10 amps of rating, and a lot of the single pole, single throw switches like you might use on a Marshall were physically too big because they would hit the chassis here. And I thought I had a line on some from Yamaha who has Ampeg now, but the ones that they are using in the Heritage have all been used up apparently, and they're out of stock, and it's just a fun time for things to be stocked. The original was a short bat. Most of the replacements were long bats. This is kind of a medium bat, which doesn't look too out of place next to the polarity switch. You'll see that later. And this is a double pole single throw switch, each side of which is rated for 6 amps. So I've paralleled them so it can handle 12 amps. So that's nice. And I was able to bend them so that there is enough of a gap for safety between the bottom connection, which is the mains, hot, and chassis. It's not as far away as I would prefer, but there's just not really anything that's ideal on the market, and this works, and it is safe, and it is rated for slightly more than the current necessary. This terminal strip is also new, and it has the dropping resistor for the stage. I've got a 5 watt here. It's got a new filter cap for the preamp stuff, and I've got a cap here which is just floating the ground, so there's no loop, there's no hum, and the whys of that would be a long explanation. Trust me that sometimes a floating ground reference is necessary in an amp. The rest of the amp, the preamp, was in real good shape. I touched up a lot of solder joints that weren't so fantastic. That's very common on these Ampegs. And I cleaned all the switches and pots, but pretty minor stuff. One of the issues that's remaining is that this amp is supposed to have 12 DW7 tubes, and JJ's got one, the ECC, ECC 832 or 80832, can't remember. Anyway, those are out of stock a lot of places, almost everywhere right now. There is an Electro-Harmonix that I can get artificially high price right now, about $35. So I need to talk to the owner. Right now it's got one correct tube, and the others are all 12AX7s. So this amp is not going to be behaving as it was designed, but it's safe enough for now, and I'll talk to him about whether he really wants to spend the money for the correct tubes. It's a matter of current versus voltage. Again, that gets kind of into the weeds. I don't think that any of the 12AX7s will be damaged from the current on their cathodes. They're cathodiene circuits, just like you'd find as a cathode follower or a cathodiene phase inverter. But it's at least at the point now where it's working, and it's working fairly properly. Let me move to the rest of the amp. Doesn't look like a lot has changed other than this PCB with the filter caps. A lot has changed as far as the grounding. Got the heater balance resistors here rather than the old pot, which was failing. I replaced this jack right here with one which normals, so that when something is plugged in here, the signal from the preamp is cut off. The original one, it was always blending them in, so you always had whatever residual hiss from the preamp being blended in with whatever you fed in here. And had to redo the ground scheme quite a bit to get the quietest operation. It's very tricky. And I found, there's a reason this board says Rev 1. I found a different way to do it in the future. I can still use these boards while I go through this stash. It's not a big mistake. It's just one ground needs to go somewhere else than I had expected, because ampegs are weird, and it's a very convoluted system as to the signal flow and the ground flow and all that. But I have found the optimal method. If I make these available for sale, it'll be the Rev 2, which will already have that correction made. And I would give out instructions for how to connect everything. But I'm very pleased with it, and it should be pretty rock solid. It's got a new hospital-grade power cable, SJT, rated for the correct current. The ground is slightly longer than the hot and neutral. Had to redo some connections on the multi-pin connector going from here to the chassis. That was a lot of fun to try to make that work. Something that was crimped in 1974 or whatever. That stuff wears out. And this part is no longer available to redo it from scratch. I came pretty close to drilling a 1/4-inch jack in here and into the preamp chassis as well, just to get a more solid audio connection, but proved unnecessary. I was able to rework the old one. So let me show you some stuff up close, which is one of the reasons I went with this solution. You can see here that the pad is lifted off the board, and that's the case a lot of places where power connection's been made. I don't know whether a previous tech used the wrong heat, or just one of those things that happens, because these things were never built well. This is a 3-ounce copper pour. I don't think this is even 1 ounce on the old board. These things were very cheap. People complain a lot about the reissue fenders in terms of being a flimsy one-sided board. Old Ampegs and old Marshalls don't have any better board than Fenders do today. The difference between an old Marshall and this, and between this and an old, a reissue Fender, the Marshalls tend to keep all the stuff that gets hot off the PCB, with the exception of the dropping resistors. Those, in fairness, only generate heat if and when a filter cap begins to fail. So by taking all the stuff that gets hot off their cheap PCB, the Marshalls from the 70s and early 80s, didn't have a lot of problems as far as operation and burning, though, because just like this, that flimsy copper, a lot of Marshalls that have been worked on over the years, if they're not worked on by a tech who knows what they're doing, it's real easy to lift pads and burn and damage traces. And that's what we see on, if someone brings in a 76 Marshall, I expect to see this. Someone brings in an old SVT, I expect to see this. The SVT has some components here, and sometimes these diodes, and sometimes a couple other dropping resistors where there can be heat. So it's not uncommon to see burned areas on these boards. Here and here, for instance, or particularly the ones on the plates and the screen connections. So that's a place where the Ampeg board is not as good as the Marshall, just because there are things mounted on this board which get hot. The Fender reissues are built just as badly as this, just as badly as the old Marshalls, but they have things which get hot, like the screen connections, and the dropping resistors like to burn on the Fenders, because the filter caps fail, and when the filter caps fail, more current is drawn, and the resistors begin to have more current than they were rated for, and so you get PCB damage, all because they use really crappy IC brand filter caps. But the other thing that Fender does is they have the quick connects for the heater connections on their PCB, and that generates an awful lot of heat. So it's not the PCB. It's who designed the PCB and made decisions as to what was going to be laid out and what other components they use. This PCB here, this new one, is infinitely better than anything you'd find in an old Marshall, an old Ampeg, or almost anything made today. You get into Sur, you get into Fryette, you get into other real high-end PCB apps. You see things like this because this is what works. You don't find stuff like this in a high-quality amp today. But people buy stuff like this with hot things mounted on it, all because someone's saving a nickel, and people think the problem is PCB. No, the problem is the company did not respect you as a buyer. They did not respect you enough to build something that would last 5 seconds past the warranty. PCBs don't have to suck. Anyway, I digress. Let's hear this thing. That's enough of that. I'll probably get a real bassist in to do the actual demo of this when it is done. I am still, sadly, more a bass owner than a bass player, both due to time and my right wrist injury, which is an ongoing fun thing. But I'm really pleased with it. Right now, the noise floor is still a little bit higher than I would like. It's coming from the preamp, but right now, it's got a bunch of 12AX7s where it should have 12DW7s. So the gain is a little bit artificially high, which will give us a higher noise floor than the amp would have if it has the correct tubes. So I'll have to talk to the owner and see what he's inclined to do. I mean, it sounds better now than it probably has in 20, 30 years, but it still doesn't sound its best. And I'm not playing around with the tone stack or anything right now. Everything's set flat. I've confirmed that everything's working. You'll get a real playing audio demo of it later. But it is so nice to no longer go and hum horribly and all the things it used to be doing. Very promising.